Afrikaner refugees. That's not a phrase I ever thought I would say, but on Saturday morning, US President Donald Trump signed an executive order cutting all funding to South Africa and announced a plan to resettle all Afrikaner refugees to America. And you actually have to read the executive order itself to understand the madness. From Section 2, it is the policy of the United States that as long as South Africa continues these unjust and immoral practices that harm our nation, the United States shall not provide aid or assistance to South Africa, and the United States shall promote the resettlement of Afrikaner refugees escaping government-sponsored race-based discrimination. And then from Section 4, quote, refugee resettlement and other humanitarian considerations, the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Homeland Security shall take appropriate steps consistent with the law to prioritize humanitarian relief, including admission and resettlement through the United States Refugee Admissions Program for Afrikaners in South Africa who are victims of unjust racial discrimination. This is genuinely one of the most absurd things I have ever read. And I read Twilight so I could talk to girls. Now, I don't know about you, but I have never even heard the most swart-gevaard, propaganda-misled, allergic to facts, oranje-headed Afrikaner describe themselves as a refugee. As we all know, a refugee is someone who is forced to flee for their life from war zones, incomprehensible violence, the destruction of their lifestyles, communities, and they often have to flee to literally stay alive. That's what a refugee is. How crazy is it then that our refugees play for the Springboks? I don't know about refugees from other countries, but I'm pretty sure they don't get to play for, be glorified, and extremely well paid as national representatives of a beloved sports team. Refugees. And to be clear, I'm not criticizing Afrikaners here. I'm criticizing the absurdity of the US government granting them refugee status. Is the US government also going to help them take their wine farms, other farms, game reserves, vast tracts of land, homes in the suburbs, second homes in the bush, third homes in Mossel Bay? Oh, and also many Afrikaner-owned businesses that are listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange that are worth millions, sometimes billions of rands. Because that's the thing, right? Of course, many Afrikaners are not wealthy, but the vast majority of Afrikaners are way better off and have way better quality of life than the vast majority of South Africans. And the vast majority of Afrikaners, were they to head to the USA, would have far worse lives than they do here. Trump is granting refugee status to a group of people who benefited from centuries of violent economic engineering built off the vile oppression and exploitation of people of color. And since 1994, this group of people has been allowed to keep all that wealth. They haven't fled the country, you know, the way refugees do. Because the one thing about being a refugee, you flee whether the US has offered you asylum or not. You don't wait for an invite. You have to flee. And there are so many other ways that this is absurd, guys. Here's another one. What, according to Trump, is an Afrikaner? Like, does he mean the ethno-cultural group of white Afrikaans-speaking people as defined by the apartheid government? You know, the government that called themselves Europeans just over 30 years ago? Does he mean them? Does he mean Jack Parow, who many conservative Afrikaners say is killing the Afrikaans language and culture? Does he mean born and raised Afrikaans-speaking people of color? You know, the descendants of the people who literally invented the Afrikaans language. Does he mean them? Does he just mean white people who just speak Afrikaans well enough? Because I got 79% in matric tweede in Natal. Do I make the cut? Man, I fell off, hey? Yo, that picture. And that's the next absurdity of this executive order. If there truly is horrific race-based discrimination that is rendering white people refugees, then why did only Afrikaners get invited to America? What about little old English refugee me? Don't I get a plane ticket? And here's one more absurdity for you. This executive order is ironically wildly racist, because one of the first things that Trump's government did was to stop all refugee and asylum programs to America from countries which genuinely have refugees who are fleeing real threats. The vast majority of those real refugees are people of color. He stopped all of that. And then he makes a special exemption for the white Afrikaans South Africans. They're the only ones who can get refugee status. It would be laughable if it wasn't so bigoted. So now we need to talk about how we got here and the response to this ridiculous US executive order, because it has been extraordinary. So let's start with how we got here. The truth is that a few factors probably contributed to the American government's decision. It's partially our case against Israel at the International Court of Justice, which has enraged particularly American conservatives. It's partially our involvement in BRICS and our don't ask, don't tell approach to Russia-Ukraine. It's definitely that Pretoria Boys High ex-student who has spread so much disinformation and fake news about South Africa and is now the real president of the USA. And it's also definitely Afriforum, guys, a South African lobby group that has toured the world spreading hysterical propaganda about threats to Afrikaners and misrepresenting what is actually going on in South Africa. Just for a few receipts, because I love a receipt. Here is Afriforum's Carly Creel celebrating that he and Ernst Rutz met John Bolton, then USA National Security Advisor to Donald Trump. He wrote that they gave Bolton Rutz's new Kill the Boer book on farm murders and expropriation without compensation, and he tagged Afriforum. And then here is another receipt, Ernst Rutz letting us know that he and Carly Creel arrived in England on their way to USA to garner support and lobby against racist theft, land expropriation, and farm murders. And finally, here is Creel and Rutz celebrating that they managed to score an interview with Fox News with Tucker Carlson, then the most watched political opinion show in America. After that, Tucker Carlson did a segment on land grabs in South Africa, which, as we all know, have never happened. It has been comprehensively, exhaustively, repeatedly proven that this has never happened by so many local and international journalists and research teams. The only example that they love to use is Akaland Boerdery in Limpopo. They love to claim that this was land was expropriated without compensation. But, newsflash, that's a lie. Court documents prove that the state offered the owners of this place 20 million rand for the farm, and in the end, the owners turned the state down and sold that farm to a private mining company for 80 million rand instead. Again, there has been no expropriation without compensation in South Africa. Not in the new South Africa anyway. Land grabs were kind of apartheid's whole thing. And the English South African-led government's whole thing before that. And colonialism before that. But since 1994, there have been no land grabs at all. And yet, Afriforum have created a years-long global campaign built on disinformation to try and convince the world that there is some great evil afoot in South Africa against white people, and particularly white Afrikaners. After Tucker Carlson did that South Africa land grabs piece, Donald Trump tweeted about South Africa for the first time. He directed members of his administration to investigate these land grabs. And in the years since, Afriforum has continued its worldwide nonsense offensive. All of that culminated in Trump's ridiculous interview with the press early last week, where he said that South Africa is doing terrible things without telling us what those things were, except confiscating land, which, again, has not happened. That was early last week, and then on Saturday, the executive order was published. And Afriforum immediately said, wasn't me. They did their best Shaggy impression. They immediately distanced themselves from Trump's views. They said they had no idea where Trump got these crazy ideas about South Africa, but it wasn't them. This is hilarious, guys. Early last week, Afriforum did a ton of media interviews after the Trump press interview, but before the executive order, and they were glowing. They were like a white woman at a market. They were so thrilled. Suddenly now, they're not so happy. They wanted the US to sanction South Africa's democratically elected leaders and target our democratically elected government to try and meddle with and change our government's policies. This refugee resettlement offer was not what they meant. And suddenly, Afriforum realized how badly wrong this has gone for them, because they know the vast majority of Afrikaners don't want to move to America for a far worse life than they have here. So Afriforum had to walk back their own horror messaging about how bad it is to be an Afrikaner in South Africa. Afriforum even said Afrikaners can't go to the USA because their culture would not survive in America. Really? Really, Afriforum? So you're saying that your culture survives here? You're saying you're cool to stay, actually? Huh, I've never heard of refugees saying, actually, nah, we're good, we're fine. Trump inadvertently screwed them because they were left with a choice they didn't want to make. Either leave South Africa as refugees for a worse life in America, or admit that their lives are just not so bad. And they had to go with the latter. and now they're scrambling, terrified that Trump will extend this anti-South Africa position by cancelling AGOA, which is the special trade agreement that gives our farmers preferential access to the American market, which would screw Afriforum's own supporters. To use two very common turns of phrase, Afriforum made their bed, and now they've their bed. And now all the allies are fighting, guys. It's weird. Agri-SA has fought with Afriforum. That's like conjoined twins having a punch-up. The DA has walked back its doomsday warnings about the Expropriation Act. Gayton McKenzie is being dragged for saying that the US has the right to, quote, ask, intervene, or even instruct on South African domestic policy because they give us funding. And the MK party has been lekker quiet. Yes, you may have missed this, but the MK party has been absolutely twirling for Donald Trump since he was inaugurated. The party that self-identifies as the real progressive party in South African politics released a statement that read, quote, the MK party views President Trump's leadership as a beacon of hope for dismantling systems of exploitation and oppression that were perpetuated under previous administrations. His administration's vision signals a transformative shift towards addressing long-standing global injustices. The MK party also welcomes President Trump's intention to lift unfair sanctions imposed on progressive nations. This statement came out barely a few weeks ago. MK also rejected the Expropriation Act of South Africa as not going far enough. You know, the Expropriation Act that Trump rejected for going too far. And yet, in the last handful of days, as chaos has reigned across South Africa, MK has said absolutely nothing about Trump. Nothing. Leadership, Umsholozi, leadership. So, where are we now? Monday, the 10th of February, 2025. We're waiting to see if America lashes out at South Africa in any other ways. Remember, Trump has not put sanctions on South Africa. There was some confusion over the weekend because some media reported that Trump had sanctioned South Africa, which I understand, but that misled people into believing we were under sanctions. He may still actually sanction the country. So, as we wait and see, now you know what has actually gone on in South Africa in the last week.